It's bad enough for an NFL team to be terrible for an entire season, and we covered the 10 worst NFL teams in the Super Bowl era in another video, which is linked in the description below. But what about when that stench lingers for multiple seasons? Yeah, that makes it even worse. We're going to be unstitching those old wounds here as we count down the 10 worst 3-year stretches in the Super Bowl era. As always, we make these determinations using C-Score, this channel's metric for measuring the quality of an NFL team. A deeper explanation of C-Score can also be found in this video's description. Now, a franchise can show up on this list more than once. Say a team has a bad stretch from 2000 to 2002, and again from 2010 to 2012. They're both able to make the top 10, but there can be no overlap. That same franchise that had a bad stretch from 2000 to 2002, and again from 2001 to 2003, will only see the worst of those stretches counted. We'll start things off at number 10 with the lowly Jacksonville Jaguars from 2012 to 2014. Their combined C-score for these 3 seasons is just about -85, and they were bad in each of the 3, with 2012 being the worst of the bunch. They compiled a 9-39 record, scoring just about 15.5 points per game, while allowing more than 27 points per game. Original Jaguars owner Wayne Weaver sold the team ahead of the 2012 season to Shad Khan, who still owns the team today. And while the Jags haven't exactly reached the upper echelons of the league, these 3 seasons were the worst. In 2012, Gene Smith was the team's general manager, and Mike Mularkey was the head coach. They were both replaced in 2013 by David Caldwell and Gus Bradley, respectively. They ran out some decent talent during this time, including tackle Eugene Monroe and defensive lineman Tyson Alualu and Senderick Marks. The best of the bunch was probably linebacker Paul Posluszny, while the most well-known was running back Maurice Jones-Drew. The Jags finally had a turnaround season in 2017, in which they 100% should have made it to the Super Bowl, a team we covered in our video of one-year wonders. We get a crossover team at number 9, as we look at the Buffalo Bills from 1969, their last season in the AFL, through to 1971, their first 2 seasons in the newly merged NFL. They weren't too terrible in 69, but once they joined the league, they got worse in 1970 and even worse beyond that in 1971. During this time, they were 8-33-1, failing to score even 15 points per game and allowing just about 26 points per game. Original owner Ralph Wilson, whose name adorned the Bills Stadium from 1998 to 2015, was the overseer of this group, while Bob Lustig served as general manager the entire time. They had gotten former Raiders head coach John Roush for the 69 season, but he only lasted 2 years, getting replaced by Harvey Johnson in 1971. The Bills didn't completely lack for talent during this era. Harry Jacobs was a top-notch linebacker, and Butch Bird was a versatile defensive back. Haven Moses and Marlon Briscoe were a good pair of wide receiver, and Billy Shaw was a stalwart at guard. And at running back was Hall of Famer O.J. Simpson, who of course is known for activities beyond the football field. Buffalo was able to get a winning record by 1973, making the playoffs in 1974, and winning the division in 1980. And I think we all know what the early 90s looked like for them. Love you blue, but they didn't have a lot of love on the field. The Houston Oilers of 1982 to 1984 come in at number 8. We're starting to get close to the -90 range of combined C-score here, with the Oilers coming in at about 88.7. And it's almost impressive how consistently bad they were during these 3 seasons, with their highest and lowest C-scores just barely being separated by a point. They only won 6 games during this time, losing 35. Of course, there were fewer games played in 1982. They were able to put up just over 16 points a game, but were allowing in almost 28. Bud Adams was in his 23rd year as owner of the Oilers in 1982, and that stability maintained itself in the GM's office, with Lad Herzeg in that role for all 3 of these seasons. Head coach was a different story. Ed Biles coached in 1982, but couldn't make it out of 83, replaced midway by Chuck Studley. Hugh Campbell held the reins in 84. Despite this terrible run of play, the Oilers rostered 6 eventual Hall of Famers. Wide receiver Tim Smith was a good player for them, but he wasn't one of them. Linebacker Robert Brazile was, so were tight end Dave Casper and young offensive linemen Bruce Matthews and Mike Munchak. They still had Elvin Bethea at the end of his career, and in 1984 they welcomed rookie quarterback Warren Moon. The Oilers found themselves in the playoffs in 1987, and they made it back every season thereafter all the way through 1993, with a couple of division titles mixed in. They were even the highest rated AFC team in C-score each year from 91 to 93. Yet, they never could advance to the AFC title game, let alone a Super Bowl. Most know the Patriots today for a lot of winning, but before that was a lot of losing. New England from 1990 through 1992 checks in at number 7. We have gotten very close to negative 90 now in C-score, with the Patriots coming out at 89.859. They were truly awful in 1990, hitting close to negative 40. They had a bit of a bounce back season in 91, but dropped right back down in 92. They won 9 out of the 48 games they played, not even scoring 12.5 points per game. The defense was a little bit better, allowing just over 23 points per game. These Patriots weren't just having problems on the field. Off the field, they endured a scandal involving female reporters in the locker room, as well as some ownership changes that left the franchise directionless. Victor Kiam was the owner in 1990 and 91, with James Orfwine taking the team over in 92, only holding on to him for 3 seasons. The GM changed hands and titles every year, and Rod Rust, well known but not liked by longtime Pats fans, gave way to the affable Dick McPherson for the 91 campaign at head coach. Former number 1 overall pick Irving Fryer was still around at wide receiver, and Bruce Armstrong was a stalwart on the O-line. D-linemen Brent Williams and Tim Goad teamed up with linebackers Vincent Brown and future Hall of Famer Andre Tippett to form a relatively solid defensive core. Bill Parcells came aboard in 1993. They made the playoffs in 1994, the first year of Robert Kraft's ownership. And following Parcells were Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick, and we all know what Belichick has done. It's highly likely that the Patriots employed 3 Hall of Fame coaches consecutively from 1993 to 2022. That's pretty darn good. At around this same time, the Patriots' principal non-division rival during the 21st century was also a football sinkhole. The 1991 through 1993 Indianapolis Colts come in here at number 6, and we have now crossed negative 90 in C-score, with the Colts having negative 90.8, and almost half of that was carried by their miserable 1991 season. In 1992, they actually had a winning record, the only winning record we're going to see anywhere on this list, but it was very fluky because even though they were 9-7, they were negative 16 in C-score, which means they were well below average. 93 mostly merged these scores into one at just over negative 30. Even though they won 9 games in 92, their combined record was still 14-34. Their pitiful offense couldn't put together 11.5 points per game, while their defense was giving up more than 22. The Irsay family has been around the Colts for a long time. Bob Irsay was the team's owner at this time, and his son Jim Irsay, the current owner, was the GM through many lean years. It helps to be the owner's son after all. Ron Meyer didn't last the 1991 season as head coach, getting replaced by Rick Venturi. Former Baltimore Colts coach Ted Marchibroda came in for the 92 season. Bill Brooks made for a solid possession receiver, but most of what the Colts had at this time was defensive, including D-lineman John Hand, and a nice trio of linebackers including Dwayne Bickett, Jeff Herrod, and Chip Banks, although Banks was at the end of his career. 2 years later, the Colts shockingly found themselves in the AFC Championship game and was a nearly caught Hail Mary from heading to the Super Bowl. Then they were terrible again and wound up with the first pick in the 1998 NFL Draft. That brought in Peyton Manning, and the Colts got pretty decent after that. Born in 1976, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers ranked out as the worst single-season team in the entire Super Bowl era, and their first 3 seasons through 1978 ranked them at number 5. That means they definitely improved over those next 2 seasons, and they certainly did. In 97, they opened the season 0-12 before winning their last 2 games. But they weren't so overwhelmingly bad like they were the year before. A -30 is definitely a very low C-score. But in 1978, they bumped up to only 5 wins, but a lot of improvement again was seen there, especially defensively, and this is the only team that we're going to see with a single season better than -10. They went 7-37, and after starting 0-26, that means they went 7-11 after that, which isn't that bad. Offense was a problem though. They couldn't quite put together 11 points per game, and after improving defensively, they were able to get that down to just over 20 points allowed per game. A big part of what made Tampa such a laughingstock over the majority of its existence is club founder and longtime owner Hugh Culverhouse, one of the worst owners by any objective standard in American sports history. He did make one very good hire for his expansion Bucs though, in head coach John McKay. McKay was the de facto general manager during this time as well, although Phil Kruger was somewhat in that role in 1978. Tampa's improvement came almost exclusively on the defensive side. Leroy Selmon was their first ever draft pick and a future Hall of Famer, and he was joined on the line by big nose tackle Dave Pear. Richard Wood and Dewey Selmon, Leroy's brother, held down the linebacker corps. And the secondary was exceptional with the likes of Mike Washington, Jarris White, and Mark Cotney. In year 4, the Bucs broke through with a winning record and made it to the NFC Championship game. They stayed reasonably competitive for a few seasons, then went into the tank of terrible for a very long time after that. Welcome back, Houston. We travel back about a decade to another putrid 3-year period for the Oilers, from 1971 to 1973, ranking in at number 4. They got progressively worse over these 3 years. In 1971, they were clearly bad, -17.5 C-score, but then it started teetering into historically bad, with a 34-42 the following 2 years. They only won 6 games against 35 losses and a tie during this 3-year stretch, not quite scoring 15 points a game, allowing 27.5. Bud Adams was the team's owner, of course, but you gotta love all the other titles he gave himself. Founder, chairman, president, and CEO. All that means, though, is he takes more responsibility for this mess. John Breen and Ed Hughes were the GM-coach combo in 1971, but Bill Peterson took over as head coach in 75, and Sid Gilman took over as GM in 1973. When Peterson left the team after 5 games, Gilman also took over as head coach. Fred Willis was a decent running back for them, Mike Tilleman filled out at defensive tackle, and Garland Boyette set the tone of linebacker. But like our other entry from the Oilers, there are Hall of Famers here too. Elvin Bethea is one earlier in his career. Wide receiver Charlie Joyner, who was traded in 1972, was another, and safety Ken Houston was yet another. Houston eventually climbed out of their slumber, but they were stuck in a division with the powerhouse of the 70s, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Yet, they reached the AFC title game in 1978 and 1979, only to lose to Pittsburgh. They then stank again, as witnessed by our number 8 entry on this list. Speaking of franchises we've seen before, the Boston and New England Patriots from 1970 to 1972 owned the 3rd worst 3-year run in the Super Bowl era, and as they did when they were at number 7, they're here following the Oilers. They were horrible in both 1970 and 1972, with a small respite in the middle. Imagine if they were as bad as they were in 71, they would easily be topping this list. As is, their combined C-score is almost negative 96, during which time they put up an 11-31 record, not scoring 14 points a game and allowing nearly 27. At least their ownership was stable this time, with founder Billy Sullivan in the luxury suites. Not so much everywhere else though. George Sauer Jr., father of the Jets wide receiver, was the GM in 1970. As they changed from the Boston Patriots to the New England Patriots, Upton Bell took over GM duties. Head coach was even worse. Clive Rush left during the 70 season to be replaced by John Mazur, and he left during the 72 season to be replaced by Phil Bankston. Houston Antwine was about the only notable defensive player for the Pats during this time. Jim Plunkett at quarterback wasn't great, but in this team he was a standout, handing it off to Carl Garrett, tossing it to Randy Vahada, and being protected by center John Morris and guard Mike Montler. The Pats slowly got better, culminating in a great 1976 season when they were a legitimate Super Bowl contender, and they had a nice run in the mid-80s where they actually made it to a Super Bowl. They got plastered in that game, but hey, they made it after all. We saw the first 3 years of the Buccaneers franchise. Now we have the birth of the Atlanta Falcons from 1966 through 1968. Despite coming in second here, none of these individual seasons are a bottom 10 season, which is quite remarkable because the Falcons have now broken the negative 100 barrier here, going all the way to minus 104.5, with seasons of negative 36 or so twice, and an improvement, quote unquote, to negative 31 and 68. They went 6-35-1, barely scoring 13 points, and over this 3-year period, 42 games at the time, they gave up nearly 30 points per game. As an expansion franchise, Atlanta was smart to look for consistency. Owner Rankin Smith and GM Frank Wall held their positions through 1968, while head coach Norb Hecker made it to 68, but didn't finish the season, with Hall of Fame quarterback Norm Van Brocklin taking the reins. The Falcons had defensive back Ken Reeves and running back Junior Coffey during this time, as well as O-lineman Ed Cook, who was at the end of his career. They brought in rookie defensive end and future Hall of Famer Claude Humphrey in 1968, but Atlanta's best player by far during this era, and still a candidate as the franchise's greatest player ever, was linebacker Tommy Nobis, himself a future Hall of Famer. It was in their 6th season where Atlanta got their first winning record, but it wasn't until 1978 that they made the playoffs, and 1980 that they won a division title. After 58 years of existence though, the Falcons have only made the Super Bowl twice, losing one of those games, and handing the other one over on a silver platter. And now at number 1, the true bottom of the barrel, are the St. Louis Rams from 2007 to 2009. Remember the rule that there couldn't be any overlap between 3-year periods? If not for that, the 2008 to 2010 Rams would have made the top 10, and the 2009 to 2011 Rams would have just missed. They were that bad. But for this 3-year period, oh my goodness, look at these numbers. Negative 111 in combined C-score, getting worse by the year. Negative 31 in 07, negative 36 in 08, and an astonishing near negative 43 in 09. Despite longer regular seasons, they only compiled 6 wins against 42 losses, scoring fewer than 14 points per game and allowing nearly 28. Unfortunately for the Rams, their ownership went through a lot of strife. Georgia Frontiere owned the team in 2007, before sadly passing away in early 2008. Her estate officially owned the team, with Frontiere's children Chip Rosenblum and Lucia Rodriguez presiding over the estate. Jay Zygmunt didn't return as GM in 2009, replaced by Billy Devaney, and head coach was quite the carousel, with the Rams employing Scott Linehan, Jim Haslett in an interim role, and Steve Spagnuolo. Torrey Holt and Steven Jackson led the offense, but the Rams had more talent on defense, including defensive end Chris Long, linebacker Will Witherspoon, and defensive backs Ron Bartell and O.J. Atogwe. The Rams hadn't had a winning season since 2003 and didn't have another one until 2017 when they moved back to Los Angeles, although they were more mediocre than terrible. After Sean McVay became their head coach, the Rams have now made it to 2 Super Bowls and even winning one. Taking a quick look at the top 10, it's worth noting that none of these teams maintained the same owner, GM, and head coach during their 3-year runs, although Atlanta came very close. The range from top to bottom was almost 27 full points in C-score, showing just how bad these teams at the very bottom were. The Rams are not the only team from the free agency and salary cap era on this list, as the Jacksonville Jaguars were kind enough to join them. And the Colts edged into that territory with their bad run extending into free agency of 1993, but not quite the salary cap. Thank you so much for staying with us this long. Please give the video a like and some shares, and if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. I would be ever so grateful. At some point, hopefully soon, we will be presenting the inverse to this group, the top 10 best 3-year runs during the Super Bowl era. If you have any particular countdowns you'd like to see, please sound off on them in the comments below. I'd love to hear any thoughts you may have about anything else as well. Thank you so much for all of your support, and until next time, I hope you have an awesome day.